The sports world didn't freeze because of a buzzer beater. It didn't freeze because of a trade or a championship. It froze because a 22-year-old woman walked into a boardroom and quietly dismantled the entire power structure of women's basketball without breaking a sweat. And the most shocking part? The one person brave enough to tell the truth about it wasn't a journalist, wasn't an analyst, and wasn't even someone you'd expect to be in Clark's corner. It was the woman the media spent an entire year convincing you was her biggest enemy. What's happening behind the closed doors of the WNBA right now is messier, more calculated, and more fascinating than anything that's played out on the court. And once you understand the full picture, you'll never look at this league the same way again. Nobody saw it coming. Not the veterans, not the league executives, not the media networks that had spent months crafting their own version of Caitlin Clark's story. When the news broke that Clark had formally signed a multi-year deal with NBC Universal as a special contributor for their basketball coverage, the reaction wasn't celebration, it was stunned, uncomfortable silence from the people who thought they had her figured out. This wasn't a rookie accepting a small ambassador role or doing a few guest spots to stay relevant in the offseason. This was a 22-year-old securing a seat at the most powerful table in American sports broadcasting. Clark will appear on Sunday Night Football, the single most watched program in the United States, and on Big Ten Saturday night broadcasts. She will sit alongside legends like Carmelo Anthony and Vince Carter, not as a novelty, not as a token female voice, as a peer, as a broadcaster with equal standing, equal screen time, and presumably a contract that reflects exactly that. No female basketball player in history has reached this level of mainstream media integration this early in her career, not even close. The women who came before her spent decades grinding for visibility that Clark just unlocked in her first professional offseason, and she did it without asking anyone's permission. The WNBA league office responded the way it always does when something threatens its control: complete silence. No congratulations, no press release celebrating one of their own crossing into a new frontier. Just cold, calculated quiet. Because behind that silence was something far more revealing than any statement they could have issued. They knew exactly what this meant. Caitlin Clark no longer needed them as much as they needed her. And that realization terrified every executive sitting in those league offices. But while the establishment went quiet, one player chose a completely different response, and what she said and what she refused to say exposed everything. Before we get to Sophie Cunningham, you need to understand what Clark actually walked away from, because the NBC deal didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened after one of the most aggressive, high-pressure recruitment campaigns the women's basketball world has ever seen. And the people running that campaign weren't outsiders, they were insiders, powerful ones. Breanna Stewart and Napheesa Collier, two of the most recognizable names in the WNBA and high-ranking figures within the WNBA Players Association, built Unrivaled, a 3-on-3 off-season competition designed to keep top players stateside and generate a new revenue stream for the league's elite. On paper, the concept made sense. In practice, what followed raised serious questions about pressure, power, and whose interests were really being served. Reports suggest the courtship of Clark was relentless. We're talking about an offer that reportedly included over $1 million in league shares and a contract structure that was openly compared to what Inter Miami constructed to bring Lionel Messi to American soccer. That's not a casual invitation, that's a statement. That's a league essentially saying, we need you, and we're willing to pay whatever it takes to make sure you're here and not somewhere else. But behind the glamorous numbers, something uglier was brewing. According to those familiar with the behind-the-scenes dynamics, there was a narrative being pushed aggressively within certain circles. A narrative that said if Clark didn't sign with Unrivaled, she was turning her back on the sisterhood, that she was selfish, that she had an obligation to use her platform to legitimize a league built by and for her peers. The pressure wasn't just financial, it was social, it was reputational. It was the kind of pressure that's very hard to resist when you're new to a league and still trying to find your footing among veterans. Clark resisted anyway. She looked at the offer, assessed her options, and chose NBC. And when she made that choice, the reaction from certain quarters of the WNBA establishment wasn't disappointment, it was fury. Veterans who had spent months publicly questioning her talent, her worthiness, her right to the spotlight, those same veterans now felt personally betrayed that she wouldn't show up to save their off-season business venture. The irony was almost too much to process. Almost.
This is the environment Sophie Cunningham stepped into when she decided to start speaking her mind. And what she said cut right through the noise. Here's what the media never wanted you to believe. Sophie Cunningham is not Caitlin Clark's rival. She never was. The rivalry was a storyline, carefully packaged, deliberately promoted, and endlessly recycled because conflict drives clicks and outrage drives revenue. Networks replayed the same clips of physical play and hard screens on a loop because those clips kept people watching and kept people arguing. The actual relationship between these two women, and more importantly, the actual character of Sophie Cunningham, was never part of that story because the truth was far less profitable than the myth. Yes, Sophie is physical. Yes, she plays with an edge that makes opponents uncomfortable. That's not a secret, and it's not a character flaw. It's a professional identity built over years of competing at the highest level. She's a tough, seasoned veteran who doesn't soften her game for anyone, and she's never pretended otherwise. But off the court, behind the screens, and away from the manufactured drama, Sophie Cunningham has consistently been one of the most clear-eyed, business-savvy, and intellectually honest voices in the entire league. When the charter flight controversy erupted, the story about WNBA players being forced to fly commercial while male counterparts traveled in luxury, most veterans stayed carefully quiet or deflected the conversation. Cunningham didn't. She stepped forward publicly and said something that took genuine courage in that locker room environment. She stated plainly that Caitlin Clark was the reason they were no longer flying commercial. Not the league's generosity, not years of advocacy. One player's arrival changed the financial math, and Cunningham was honest enough to say so when others wouldn't. That moment revealed something important. While other veterans were busy appearing on podcasts to question Clark's credentials or posting vague social media commentary designed to undermine her without leaving fingerprints, Cunningham was giving credit where credit was due. She wasn't performing solidarity, she was practicing it. And that distinction matters enormously when you're trying to understand why her response to the NBC News landed so differently than everyone else's. Because Cunningham didn't respond with bitterness. She didn't perform outrage for the cameras. She responded with something the WNBA's old guard has never been particularly comfortable with: honesty. What Cunningham has been doing in recent weeks goes beyond just defending Clark or refusing to play into media narratives. She's been identifying something far more troubling at the core of the WNBA's off-season political structure, and she's doing it in a way that's impossible to dismiss. Think about the Unrivaled situation from a purely structural standpoint. The league was created and is operated by Breanna Stewart and Nafisa Collier. Those same two women hold significant positions within the WNBA Players Association, the organization that is supposed to represent the interests of every player in the league, including Caitlin Clark. Now ask yourself a straightforward question. If the people who are supposed to advocate for Clark's best interests are also the people running the off-season league they desperately need her to join, how exactly does that arrangement work in her favor? It doesn't. And Cunningham sees that clearly. When she speaks about authenticity and about players having the right to make their own choices without political pressure, she's pointing directly at this conflict of interest without necessarily naming it outright. She has enough experience in this league to recognize when the system is being used against the very people it claims to protect. And she's been around long enough to know that speaking up about it comes with real professional consequences. The courage that takes shouldn't be underestimated. WNBA players typically maintain a public code of solidarity. Even when they disagree privately, the expectation is that you keep those disagreements internal and present a unified front externally. Breaking that code, especially to defend a player that a vocal segment of the veteran population has decided to resent, isn't a small act. It's a declaration. Cunningham is essentially saying that she values honesty over comfort and common sense over loyalty to a clique. In the instantly political world of professional women's basketball, that's practically revolutionary. But even that doesn't fully capture the scope of what she's been exposing, because the hypocrisy runs much deeper than one off-season league. There's a culture problem in the WNBA that has been hiding in plain sight for years, and Caitlin Clark's arrival didn't create it. It just made it impossible to ignore. Cunningham has been pulling back the curtain one comment at a time, and the picture emerging is not flattering for some of the league's most celebrated figures.
Consider what happened with Sheryl Swoopes, one of the most legendary names in women's basketball history. Rather than welcoming a new era of the sport, Swoopes publicly attempted to challenge and diminish Clark's statistical achievements. A Hall of Famer, someone who should understand better than almost anyone else what it means to fight for recognition in a sport that rarely gives women their due, chose instead to direct energy toward tearing down a rookie's accomplishments. The motivation behind that decision is worth examining. Then there were the Team USA freeze-outs. Reports from sources close to the selection process described a chilly, unwelcoming environment that Clark navigated during her time with the national team. A tangible social energy that communicated, without ever needing to say it out loud, that she hadn't earned her place in the room. That no matter what she did statistically or commercially, she would remain an outsider to certain people who'd been in the inner circle long before she arrived. This is the environment Cunningham is speaking about when she pushes back against the pettiness. She watches veterans post cryptic messages about grind and loyalty on social media, messages that are clearly aimed at Clark without ever mentioning her name, while simultaneously attending events and accepting benefits that Clark's popularity directly funded. New TV deals, chartered flights, sold-out arenas. The money Clark generates flows through every corner of this league, but the respect? That apparently has to be earned through a completely different and far more arbitrary process. Clark's response to all of it was elegant in its simplicity. She didn't fight for a seat at the table. She didn't campaign for acceptance from women who'd already decided to reject her. She bypassed the table entirely. She walked into NBC's offices, signed a deal that put her alongside the biggest names in American sports broadcasting, and rendered the entire approval process irrelevant. Cunningham sees the poetry in that. While others are still writing angry tweets about loyalty, Clark purchased the whole restaurant, and Sophie Cunningham is the only veteran in the league who seems to find that genuinely impressive rather than personally threatening. Strip away the politics, the social media drama, the manufactured rivalries, and the league office's strategic silences, and what you're left with is math. Cold, simple, undeniable math. And the math tells a story that a lot of people in the WNBA would rather not confront directly. The maximum salary in the WNBA sits at approximately $250,000 per year. For context, that's less than many backup players in the NBA earn in a single week. The league's top earners, the faces of the franchise, the women who sell tickets and move merchandise and generate television ratings, they earn $250,000 in a full season. It's a number that tells you everything about how the league has historically valued its talent. The Unrivaled league offered Clark something significantly more than that. Reports suggest the deal included over $1 million in shares, real financial upside, and a structure designed to make participation feel like a genuine investment opportunity rather than just another paycheck. On its surface, it was a compelling offer, but it came with strings that weren't written into any contract. It came with the expectation of loyalty to a power structure that had shown Clark very little loyalty in return. It came with the implicit understanding that joining meant endorsing the people running the league, people who had not exactly been advocates for her well-being throughout her first season. The NBC deal, by contrast, reportedly dwarfs the WNBA salary. The exact figures haven't been disclosed, but the scale of the platform, Sunday Night Football, the most watched program in American television, suggests the compensation reflects the reach. And crucially, Clarke earns it without putting her body at risk. No defensive schemes designed specifically to injure her, no hard screens from players with something to prove, no grinding through practice sessions in Miami Heat. She sits in a studio, analyzes the game she spent her entire life mastering, builds relationships with the biggest names in sports media, and develops a brand that will outlast any playing contract she ever signs. Sophie Cunningham has fought tooth and nail for every professional dollar she's ever earned. She knows exactly how hard it is to extract fair compensation from this league. She knows what it costs physically, emotionally, and professionally to build a career in women's basketball. So when she watches peers behave as though Clarke owes them something, as though choosing her own financial future over their off-season project constitutes some kind of moral failure, Cunningham's frustration isn't just understandable, it's righteous.
This isn't a betrayal. This is the blueprint. And Cunningham is practically begging the rest of the league to be smart enough to recognize it. For years, the WNBA has held a very specific kind of leverage over its players. The league controls scheduling, it controls officiation, it controls media access, press availability, and the narrative framework within which players are allowed to present themselves publicly. If a player steps out of line, too critical, too independent, too willing to speak honestly about conditions within the league, the tools available to bring her back in line are numerous and well documented. Fines, reduced visibility, quiet conversations that aren't so quiet. The message is consistent. We gave you this platform and we can take it away. That leverage just evaporated, not partially, not temporarily, completely. Sunday Night Football draws tens of millions of viewers every single week. It is the dominant television event in the American sports calendar. When Caitlin Clarke sits at that desk alongside seasoned broadcasters and established sports personalities, she is speaking to an audience that dwarfs the WNBA's entire viewership. If she has something to say about officiating inconsistencies, about the treatment of players, about the financial structure of the league, about anything, she now has a megaphone that no WNBA executive can mute. The league used to control her access to the public. Now the situation is reversed. This is what genuinely scares the old guard. It's not just that Clarke is thriving outside their structure, it's that she's built a platform from which she could, if she chose to, cause serious reputational damage to the league without any ability on their part to prevent it. She doesn't have to say anything inflammatory, she doesn't have to attack anyone directly. Simply existing as a prominent, credible, well-compensated voice on NBC fundamentally alters the power relationship between her and the league that employs her. Cunningham understands this better than most because she's felt the league's power used against players firsthand. She's navigated the politics of officiating complaints and media access and the unspoken rules about what you can and cannot say publicly. When she sees Clarke acquire this kind of independent platform, she doesn't feel threatened. She feels something closer to relief because it demonstrates that the leverage can flow in both directions. And a player with Clarke's commercial profile and now her NBC platform is someone the league has to treat very carefully going forward. That changes the conditions for every player who comes after her. There's a dimension to this entire conversation that has been hovering over everything, largely unspoken in polite company, but absolutely present in the undercurrent of every debate about Clarke's place in the WNBA. The racial dynamics surrounding her rise have been weaponized from multiple directions simultaneously, and the result has been a conversation so toxic and so polarized that most people with a platform have chosen to sidestep it entirely rather than risk being misrepresented. On one side, there are claims that Clark's appeal is primarily demographic, that she's celebrated and marketed the way she is because of her race rather than her talent, and that this represents a systemic preference that disadvantages players of color who've been excelling in this league for decades without receiving comparable commercial attention. On the other, there are claims that the hostility Clark has faced from certain veterans is racially motivated in the opposite direction, that her treatment represents a kind of inverse prejudice that goes unacknowledged because of how the media has decided to frame women's sports stories. Both narratives are being actively promoted, both generate enormous engagement, and both, in Cunningham's estimation, appear to be missing the point entirely. Cunningham has consistently refused to engage with the racial framing of Clark's story, not because she's unaware of it, she's clearly paying attention to everything happening around her, but because engaging with it on those terms would mean accepting a framework that she evidently finds reductive and counterproductive. She treats Clark as a basketball player. She evaluates her as a business entity. She assesses the situation in terms of dollars, leverage, and professional decision-making. Doing that consistently, she exposes the absurdity of critics who are so focused on identity politics that they've lost the ability to simply watch someone play basketball and acknowledge excellence. This is one of the quieter but more significant things Cunningham has been doing. Every time she refuses to take the racial bait, every interview where she talks about the business instead of the demographics, every comment where she focuses on the game instead of the grievances, she's making a statement about what kind of conversation she thinks this sport is deserving to be having. It's a statement that's easy to overlook because it doesn't generate the kind of outrage that drives algorithms, but it's there and it matters.
Here's the question that nobody in the Unrivaled organization wants to answer publicly, but that every honest analyst is asking privately. What is the league worth without Caitlin Clark? The entire commercial logic of Unrivaled as a media product was built on a foundation that assumed Clark would participate. Television rights negotiations, sponsorship conversations, ticket sales projections, social media strategy, all of it was shaped by the understanding that the most commercially valuable player in women's basketball would be part of the product. When she declined, she didn't just remove herself from the roster, she removed the central justification for the league's valuation. Without Clark, Unrivaled is a collection of talented WNBA players competing in a 3-on-3 format during the off-season. That's a product, but it's not a phenomenon. The difference between those two things is enormous when you're trying to negotiate media rights and attract mainstream sponsorship dollars. Brands that were willing to write big checks based on Clark's projected involvement now have to reassess what they're actually buying. Networks that were excited about broadcasting opportunities have to recalibrate their audience expectations. The math changes dramatically. Cunningham is acutely aware of this. She's been around the business of this sport long enough to understand how commercial valuations actually work, and she understands that the anger directed at Clark from certain quarters is inseparable from this financial reality. The players who were loudest in their resentment of Clark's spotlight were simultaneously the most dependent on her participation to make their own business venture viable. They needed her presence to generate the revenue that would have benefited them. When she declined, they lost both the revenue and the face-saving ability to pretend they weren't counting on her. When Cunningham hears those same players criticizing Clark's choices, she's not just annoyed by the hypocrisy. She's watching people who desperately wanted Clark to save their business, turning around and attacking her publicly for not doing so. It's a level of audacity that's almost impressive in its boldness. Almost. But mostly, it's just the kind of behavior that makes clear-eyed veterans like Cunningham shake their heads and refuse to participate in the pretense. Please come rescue our project even though we've spent months undermining you. Cunningham is too sharp to let that slide without at least internally noting the contradiction, and increasingly, she's not keeping those observations entirely internal. Everything changes when the WNBA season tips off, and the change isn't subtle. When Caitlin Clark steps back onto the court for the Indiana Fever, she won't be returning as the same player who navigated her rookie season under a constant barrage of physical intimidation, political pressure, and manufactured narratives designed to put her in her place. She's coming back as something the league has never had to deal with before. She's a sophomore point guard who is simultaneously an NBC broadcaster with access to Sunday Night Football's audience. She's a player whose off-season contract news generated more sports media coverage than the actual WNBA games being played. She's an athlete whose commercial footprint has grown so large during the off-season that the league's ability to use its traditional pressure tactics against her is now genuinely questionable. The hazing is over. The rookie phase, with its unspoken expectation that she should absorb whatever the veterans chose to dish out and wait patiently for acceptance, that's finished. Clark accelerated past it by operating on a timeline and a scale that her peers simply couldn't follow. The veterans who were banking on a second season of the same dynamic are going to find themselves adjusting to a very different reality. Sophie Cunningham has already made that adjustment. While others are still processing what happened and how to respond to it, Cunningham has moved on. She's preparing for a season in which Clark is no longer the target of a hazing ritual. She's an NBC broadcaster with more name recognition than any other player on the court and a contract that reflects that reality. The smart play is obvious to anyone who can see past their own resentment. Get on board, recognize the rising tide, stop fighting a current that's been flowing in one direction since March of 2024. Cunningham's message to the rest of the league is delivered not through press conferences or long statements, but through her consistent, principled refusal to participate in the pettiness. She's showing by example that you can compete hard against Clark on the court and respect her contributions to the sport off it. Those two things aren't in conflict. Only the people who've made Clark's success about themselves rather than about basketball think otherwise.
The media had a very specific role written for Sophie Cunningham in the Caitlin Clark narrative. She was supposed to be the antagonist, the physical enforcer, the veteran who resented the rookie spotlight and expressed that resentment through aggressive play and cutting remarks. The clips were selected, the captions were written, the story was packaged and ready for distribution. Cunningham refused to perform it. Every time she was expected to fuel the conflict, she talked about basketball. Every time the media wanted her to express bitterness about Clark's success, she expressed something closer to admiration for Clark's business acumen. Every time the narrative machine tried to position her as part of the resentful old guard, she quietly demonstrated that she understands exactly what Clark represents for the future of this sport, and that she's genuinely okay with it. By doing that consistently, not once, not twice, but repeatedly over the course of an entire year, Cunningham has become something far more interesting than the villain she was supposed to play. She's become the person in the room willing to say what's true when saying what's true isn't politically convenient. In a league where social pressure, political maneuvering, and the fear of being ostracized by the in-group shape so much of what players say publicly, that's a genuinely rare quality. She's acknowledged Clark's impact when others refused. She's called out hypocrisy when others stayed silent. She's refused to participate in racial narratives when others found them useful for generating attention. She's recognized Clark's NBC deal as brilliant when the expected response was outrage. Game recognizes game. And whatever else you want to say about Sophie Cunningham, she has been playing a very smart game throughout all of this. The media script required an enemy. Cunningham handed them something much harder to monetize: the truth. Everything that's happened over the past several months has been building toward a moment of reckoning for the WNBA as an institution. The league now faces a choice that it can no longer defer, ignore, or deflect with carefully worded press releases. One path forward involves acknowledging what Caitlin Clark's presence has done for the league's commercial standing, the television deals, the ticket revenue, the mainstream media attention, and building a culture and a compensation structure worthy of the talent it's asking players to give their bodies for. It involves listening to voices like Sophie Cunningham's, who aren't asking for anything radical, just basic intellectual honesty about what's working and who deserves credit for it. It involves letting go of the need to control a narrative that has long since outgrown the league's ability to manage it. The other path is more of the same. Silence when Clark succeeds outside their structure, cryptic solidarity messaging that thinly veils resentment, a culture that continues rewarding conformity and punishing independence, a business model that depends on Clark's commercial appeal while refusing to fully extend the respect that appeal has more than earned. The players who chose resentment are already fighting a battle they've lost. The power dynamic has shifted, the leverage has moved, and Caitlin Clark, sitting at an NBC desk alongside the biggest names in American sports, doesn't particularly need their approval anymore to build the career she's building. Sophie Cunningham saw all of this clearly before most people were willing to admit it. She said what was true when it wasn't comfortable. She refused to perform a role that would have benefited the media and damaged the sport. She treated a younger player's success as something to be recognized rather than feared. And in doing so, she revealed more about the character and the dysfunction of the league around her than any documentary or investigative report ever could. The WNBA was built on the backs of women who refused to accept the idea that their sport wasn't worth watching. The least it can do is extend the same respect to the woman currently proving, beyond any reasonable argument, that they were right. Because one thing is now undeniable: Caitlin Clark changed this game, and Sophie Cunningham, of all the people in that league, had the guts to say it out loud.